Anybody who has heard the theories surrounding Johnny Gosch's disappearance on September the 5th, 1982, knows they are difficult to accept. If there are satanic pedophiles working in the top levels of the American government and law enforcement, selling kids on the black market and forcing them into prostitution, pornography, extortion, and things far worse, it's easier as a human being to simply believe that such things could not be true.
When I started talking about pedophile rings that take children as a business 20 years ago, well, people practically threw rocks at me. They didn't want to hear it. And then there was one phone call that came from a phone booth in Utah, and it was Johnny's voice on the phone, crying and begging for help. And then the man came on the phone and said, "You're never going to get your boy back," and hung up on us. And one of the laws that I did get passed was what was called the Johnny Gosch bill, and that forced the police department to start an active investigation immediately. Unfortunately, with Johnny's kidnapping, the problem we had was that the police wanted to label it a runaway for the first few weeks. Even though we had witnesses, there was foul play, they wanted to call it a runaway. One group of searchers came back to my house and said, they were very angry, and they said, "Well, I thought that you wanted help with the search." And I said, "Well, we do." And the one man that was kind of the spokesman for the group, he said, the police chief came out to the state park where we were searching, and he got up on the picnic table and used a bullhorn and yelled at the crowd and said, "Stop searching, everybody go home, this kid's nothing but a damn runaway."
Another moron.
And that was the police chief. When they came back and told me that, I knew we had trouble. Yeah. I thought he's either inexperienced with kidnappings or there's something worse going on.
Yep.
And it took years to finally find out what it was.
At what point did you decide that a pedophile ring was likely involved with this?
We lived very close to Omaha, Nebraska.
Uh-huh.
And within a couple of weeks after Johnny was taken, there was 2 other girls taken from Des Moines. And a small article appeared in the paper. The men were caught, the girls were freed, and they were brought back home. But the article said that they were sold for prostitution. So I cut that article out, and I went running up to the police department, to the same police chief, and I said, "Would you call the Omaha police chief? That's only 2 hours away. Chances are these might be the same men that were involved in Johnny's case."
Well, of course. Check any similarity out. Sure.
The police chief looked at me and he said, "No, I don't have a feel for that, so I'm not going to call them." And he didn't. So I went to the FBI office and asked them to get involved with this. And they said no, that they were not going to do that, or, in fact, they were not even going to enter Johnny's case, because the police chief had told them he didn't need their help.
Yeah.
Again, the common denominator was the police chief each time. After I was turned down by the FBI, I called all the TV stations and I did a press conference. And the very next day, I received a death threat. And the man called me up. He said, "Stop making waves or you're going to die."
They weren't using your son anymore. They were now threatening you.
That's right. So then I sat down and I thought very carefully, now what have I done that would have caused such a reaction?
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I did was demand that an investigation begin in Omaha. And many years later, we found out what the Omaha connection was.
Yeah,
and I was knocking on the back door of that and didn't even know it.
Yeah.
And that's when I really realized that there was something big. And that was only 2 weeks after the kidnapping. We hired private investigators because we were not getting the help from the police. Not till 1988, the end of 1988, we hired private investigators because we were not getting the help from the police.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not till 1988, the end of 1988, when our big break came. In Omaha, Nebraska, there was a huge scandal involving the Franklin Credit Union. And the manager there was named Larry King. And it's not to be confused with Larry King on television. It's a different guy.
Right.
They were laundering money, and he was also involved in running a prostitution and pornography ring, literally, using young children to satisfy rich pedophiles that would pay him money. They were taking kids from Boys Town, which is very famous.
It was a farm system for them, basically, wasn't it?
It was.
Mm-hmm.
And they had 80 children, that's 80 children, come forward and all tell the same stories of how they were sexually abused, taken to parties where dignitaries and businessmen and people would come in and have sex with the children. Drugs were passed around like they were going out of style.
Mm-hmm.
All but 2 children recanted their story. The families were threatened and the kids got scared and they all took back their stories.
Sure.
Except 2. One was Alicia Owens, a young girl, and the other was Paul Benassi. And what happened to those 2 kids was terrible. They charged them with perjury and they stuck them away in prison because they wouldn't recant their story.
Right.
They wouldn't lie.
How many years did Alicia languish?
Alicia was given a sentence of 15 years for a first-time offense. That was the longest sentence ever given in the United States for that offense. For a 15-year-old girl who was just telling the court how she was raped. And she was. And she became pregnant and they had a child. And Paul Benassi, when he came forward, he was in prison. He told his attorney, John DeCamp, who was a former senator,
right,
that he also helped kidnap Johnny Gosch. Well, that was major. That was major. The whole Franklin thing was under investigation. The Nebraska State Legislature had brought in Ted Gunderson, former FBI, and they hired Gary Caradori, who was a private investigator. And they investigated all of these people. And Gary Caradori told his wife the night before he made a trip to Chicago to meet with somebody that was going to provide more evidence, that he finally found out what happened to Johnny Gosch, and that when he returned from that trip, he was going to call Johnny's parents. Well, Gary went to Chicago, took his 8-year-old son with him, and they went to a ball game. And then while he was in Chicago, the fellow that he was supposed to meet was supposed to come to the ballpark because they knew they were being probably watched, and they were just being extremely careful. On the return flight, Gary's plane blew up in flames. He was murdered. And he never got back to tell anybody what he had found.
Mm-hmm.
The result of all of that brought John DeCamp to us. He contacted us and said that he had a young man who was confessing to helping kidnap my son, and that he knew exactly what happened to Johnny, where they put him, who bought him, how much they paid for him. He explained everything. That was our big break. Many years later, Paul Benassi was allowed to sue Larry King.
Yeah, he won $1 million in court.
$1 million, and I was in the courtroom.